An almost 47-year-old mystery has now been resolved. A 16-year-old girl named Carol Sue Klaber was found strangled to death on June 5, 1976, shocking her family and the entire community of northern Kentucky. Despite years of investigation, there were no leads or suspects, and the case remained unsolved until new technology played a key role in putting the puzzle together. Who could have harmed Carol Sue Klaber in this way, and how did the murderer escape justice for such a long time? Hello and welcome back to Mystery Detective, where we explore baffling cases from around the globe. We'll explore the enigmatic Carol Sue Klaber case today, a 47-year-old cold case that was finally solved in 2023. But first, if you haven't already, kindly click the bell icon, like this video, and subscribe to inspire us to make more engaging true crime content for you. Having said that, let's dive right into this mystery without further ado. Kentucky in the United States is home to the county of Boone. Boone County was established in 1798 and was named after Daniel Boone. The Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport, a key hub for the area, is located in Boone County, which is the fourth most populous county in Kentucky. Burlington serves as the county seat, and the county is well known for its historical sites, outdoor recreation areas, and robust agricultural sector. However, a tragic murder would occur in this area of Boone in 1976. On November 28, 1959, a new life was born into the world in the state of Kentucky. Daniel Henry Klaber and Betty Jane Meek Reniker, her proud parents, were beaming with pride as they held their adorable baby girl in their arms and gave her the name Carol Sue Klaber. Thomas Klaber, her older brother, watched on in wonder, excited to welcome his new sister into the family. Carol was incredibly funny. She had a great deal of empathy for those who were less fortunate and was surprisingly modest for a teenager. At the age of 16, she volunteered at St. Charles Nursing Home. In her younger years, Carol had also been a Brownie and a Girl Scout. She loved to sew, cook, play records, and listen to music constantly. She began taking piano lessons when she was 5 years old. Carol was chosen by her piano teacher, Hattie Schatzman, to represent her students at the Ohio Music Teacher Association while she was also learning how to play the violin. She had performed 2 times at the Taft Museum. She was a beloved member of the Dixie Heights High School String Ensemble, thanks to her love of music and natural talent, and her classmates were drawn to her outgoing and kind nature. Sadly, her family, friends and teachers won't be able to see much of her talents anymore as a tragedy soon befell Carol. On June 5, 1976, as the sun rose and shined brightly over the Kentucky town of Union, Dr. Gaines Huey, a respected Walton dentist who was ready to attend to his patients' dental needs, left his home early in the morning as the neighborhood's residents started their days as usual. As Dr. Gaines traveled down Chamber Road, he noticed something unusual at the road's edge. He soon stopped his car out of curiosity and moved toward the thing. It wasn't until he was close enough that he realized what he had discovered. There was a body lying eerily still next to a culvert that served as a rainwater drainage pipe. Dr. Gaines, who was in a state of shock, immediately dialed the Kentucky State Police with trembling hands. Jan Wuchner just so happened to be working that day. Jan Wuchner, an experienced detective who had previously worked for the Boone County Sheriff's Department, hurried to the scene in order to solve the mystery surrounding the dead body that was lying by the roadside. Around 7:15 a.m., detectives from the Walton State Police Department arrived at the crime scene. With a keen eye for detail, their eyes swept the area where the body was. The detectives started their investigation after spotting the obvious indications of a struggle. Broken twigs and trampled grass suggested a violent altercation between the victim and her attacker. After being viciously attacked, the victim, who was a female, was strangled to death. As their sense of dread increased, the investigators grimly realized that this was a murder rather than a random act of violence. Despite their best efforts and their determination to search every possible angle in their pursuit of justice, the investigators were unable to uncover any tangible evidence at the crime scene. They then settled to look for information on the victim's body. Her body was taken to the county medical examiner's office so that a thorough autopsy could be performed. The medical examiner meticulously performed an autopsy, searching every square inch of the victim's body for clues. Every wound, scrape, and cut was meticulously recorded, and each hint was carefully examined. The gruesome details of her death were made clear by the autopsy findings. According to the evidence, she had endured a brutal beating. Her body was marked by the obvious effects of a tire iron used with relentless force. The once beautiful face was now deformed by swelling and bruising, and the examiner observed the woman's deep scalp wounds, which were probably caused by a blunt object. She had suffered an irreparable head injury from the crushing blow, which had tragically and prematurely ended her life. There were also obvious indications of physical brutality and abuse. All those involved experienced a heartbreaking moment, and the cause of death was finally identified as asphyxia brought on by manual strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. The investigation took on a new level of urgency after the discovery of such viciousness. Investigators found some traces of foreign DNA on the victim's clothing while examining the scene's evidence. They did their best to match it to someone at the time, but they failed. They, however, carefully stored the evidence in the anticipation of future technological developments, confident that it might someday result in a breakthrough in the investigation. With the aid of DNA taken from the victim's body and their tireless efforts, detectives were able to track down the victim's brother. He mustered the courage to approach the body and identify it as his sister. Thomas Kleber, who was 23 years old at the time, entered the morgue as he stood in front of his beloved sister, Carol Sue Kleber's lifeless body on a cold metal table. His face was dripping with tears. Realizing that he would never again get to see his sister's radiant smile or hear her contagious laughter, the pain in his heart was unbearable. The investigators searched every possible lead as the investigation developed. They scoured the neighborhood, knocking on doors, talking to locals, and gathering any details that might shed light on the tragic incident. In order to understand Carol Sue Kleber's life and potential enemies better, they also dug deeply into her past and spoke to her family and friends. The investigators discovered that for the Kleber family, June 4, 1976, was a typical day. Getting on her bike, Carol Sue Kleber, a 16-year-old carefree teen, got on her bike and pedaled around town with a smile on her face as the wind blew her hair. She said hello to the neighborhood residents, talked with friends, and enjoyed the warmth of the summer day. She has arranged to meet a friend at Zeno's Hyde Park restaurant later on in the evening. She left her house at 5:30 p.m., but as dusk fell, a young man driving a swanky Chevrolet Monte Carlo followed Kleber back to her house. One of the neighbors claimed to have caught a glimpse of the young man, who was towering at 6 feet tall with a slim build. He had sandy blonde hair. The man and Carol spoke briefly before Carol entered the home, leaving the man outside in anticipation. A short while later, Carol came out from the house, hopped in the car, and left with the man. That appeared to have been the last time anyone would ever see Carol alive again. The murder of Carol Sue Kleber went unsolved despite the investigators' best efforts to find the owner of the suspected vehicle. The case wasn't moving ahead and every lead had been exhausted, leaving the detectives baffled. The case eventually became unsolved, and it remained that way for more than 40 years. A ray of hope appeared in the Carol Sue Kleber murder investigation after years of no progress. Coy Cox and Timothy Adams, two cold case detectives from the Boone County Sheriff's Office, gave the case new life in 2017. In their relentless pursuit of the truth and justice for Carol Sue Kleber, these two detectives teamed up with Jerry Keith, the first detective on the case, who had kept it so dear to his heart even after retiring. The trio used cutting-edge technology to work non-stop. In order to put together a fresh perspective on the tragedy that had baffled them for years, they painstakingly went through the old evidence, speaking with witnesses and sifting through leads. The two top suspects that Keith had earlier named were the focus of their initial investigation. The first suspect was a man with a history of auto theft, whose car had a startling resemblance to the one Carol was last seen in. The detective targeted this man and examined him closely in an effort to elicit any useful information from him. The man, who was a suspect in the investigation, denied any involvement in Carol's killing. He disclosed his past crimes to the detectives as he opened up to them, but he steadfastly maintained his innocence in Carol's murder. In order to compare his DNA to the DNA that was discovered in 1976 from the victim's clothing, the detectives collected his DNA. The results of the DNA analysis arrived in December 2018 after a long wait. Finally, detectives Cox and Adams called the man to let him know that his DNA results were negative and he was no longer a suspect in Carol's murder. On hearing this, the man realized he could finally breathe easily and begin his life afresh. He felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. Following the DNA results, Cox and Adams returned to their tenacious hunt for the murderer. They were back at square one because the leads on their initial suspect had run dry. Then, in 2020, they made the decision to turn to their second suspect, who had already been found guilty of a vicious sexual assault in the same neighborhood just 2 years prior to Carol's murder. In 2020, he was 77 years old and went by the name Michael Dean Tate. Cox and Adams contacted Michael Dean Tate's assault victim from 1978 for her account of the assault as they worked to establish their case against him. She didn't reveal her name, but she remembered the night clearly. She described the frightening darkness of the Park Hills on the night of October 1, 1978, when she was viciously attacked at around 2 in the morning in her own garage. The victim remembered that despite her best efforts to fight and scream, her attacker seemed to take a sick pleasure in hurting her. But after 2 hours of hell, the attacker fled, leaving her wounded but still alive. Years passed before she was able to overcome the psychological and physical scars Tate had left behind on that fateful night. Cox and Adams were forced to consider the possibility that Tate might have been connected to the murder of Carol after learning about his involvement in the 1978 case. The detectives considered Tate as a prime suspect in Carol's murder case because he frequently traveled to the area for work in the 1970s and 1980s. Tate nevertheless maintained his innocence and denied any involvement in Carol's death despite the detectives' evidence against him. The detectives had hoped that their investigation would eventually point them in the direction of the offender. Their hopes were quickly dashed, though, when Tate's DNA was not found as a match to the DNA at the crime scene. Tate was also living in Cincinnati in 1976, according to court records, which ruled out his involvement in the crime. The detectives wondered if they would ever be able to solve this long-running case, which had lain dormant for nearly 50 years. The case remained unsolved until the Boone County Sheriff's Office contacted Othram Lab on September 17, 2022, because of their expertise in genetic genealogy. The Kentucky State Police Central Forensic Center sent a DNA sample from the 1976 crime scene to Othram Labs with funding from the Season of Justice. A team of expert scientists in Othram was able to create a complete DNA profile for the real suspect using advanced forensic-grade genome sequencing. With the aid of advanced technology, they were able to access priceless genetic data that had been kept secret for many years. Based on the comprehensive DNA profile they had created, the forensic genetic genealogy experts at Othram Labs used genealogy to generate leads for investigations. In a startling turn of events, Othram Labs provided a response on November 25, 2022, less than 2 months after receiving the DNA samples. By examining the genetic data left by the murderer, they identified a link to a man named Thomas W. Dunaway, who had passed away in 1990 at the age of 33. More research revealed that Dunaway had a son, but the boy had never met his father. The investigators made the trip to meet with Thomas Dunaway's son, whose identity was kept secret, in order to collect DNA samples for comparison. The outcomes of these significant laboratory examinations would hold the key to unlocking the mystery that had long eluded law enforcement. Detectives meticulously gathered the required samples with a desire to learn the truth and a firm commitment to justice. In January 2023, the case's lengthy investigation came to a conclusion. After nearly 47 years, Carol Sue Klaber and her family received justice when Dunaway's son's DNA partially matched the traces of DNA they had discovered on Carol's body years earlier. This was made possible by the use of cutting-edge technology and the detectives' dogged determination for justice. Although the process was difficult, the perseverance of those involved had paid off, leading to a discovery that would provide comfort to everyone impacted by the tragic events of 1976. The Carol Sue Klaber murder case was never given up on by the police. Thomas W. Dunaway, who was 19 years old at the time and was born on May 20, 1957, was able to remain undiscovered for a very long time. Detectives were able to learn important details about Dunaway's past and the terrible things he had done by being persistent and keeping an open mind. When Carol was last seen at her home with a man who resembled him, the police learned that he resided close to Devo Park. As they dug deeper, more negative information about Dunaway came to light. Dunaway was a persistent criminal. His 6-month crime spree had left a trail of evidence in the form of the vehicles he had driven away from each crime scene. Just 6 months after Carol Sue Klaber's death, in December 1976, he was found responsible for another murder, so the horror did not end there. Ronald Townsend, who was only 19 years old, was discovered lying on the ground shot to death. The news devastated the neighborhood, but Thomas Dunaway's capture and admission of guilt in Townsend's murder helped lift people's spirits. Dunaway received a life sentence, but sadly, he was only imprisoned for 7.5 years before being released in 1984. His release made the community wonder if justice could really be served. The terrifying pattern of violence and darkness that consumed Dunaway's life was revealed by Detective Coy Cox. Although Carol's murder may not have resulted in justice, the police were able to reveal the full scope of Dunaway's lethal and dangerous reign of terror. Ronald Townsend and Carol Sue Klaber murders both had unsettling similarities. Just a few inches from the road, both victims were left in full view as if the murderer were making a point. As the investigation progressed, authorities learned Dunaway was absent without leave from the army at the time of Townsend's murder. 9 days after Carol's murder, Dunaway had joined the military and was initially assigned to Fort Knox before being transferred to Fort Carson in Colorado. Thomas Dunaway, who had joined the military, couldn't seem to stay out of trouble. Dunaway had an unrivaled love for cars, but it ultimately brought him to ruin. He traded his beloved 1973 Chevrolet Monte Carlo for a striking orange Chevrolet Vega because he had an eye for a good deal. He had no idea, though, that the detectives looking into the murder of Ronald Townsend would be drawn specifically to this flashy car. Dunaway and his orange Vega were the targets of an all-points bulletin that the detectives relentlessly pursued. On the gloomy Christmas Eve of 1976, Dunaway was apprehended in South Carolina on suspicion of Townsend's murder and an unlawful possession of a firearm, putting an end to a long game of cat and mouse. The relationship between Carol Sue Klaber and Thomas Dunaway has investigators perplexed as they look deeper into the mysterious case of Carol Sue Klaber's murder. It's possible that Carol and Dunaway ran into each other when they were young and attended Erlanger-Ellesmere schools. But it's not clear how they ended up connected. However, in the midst of the confusion, Detective Coy Cox provided a crucial hint that might help solve the mystery. It's possible that Carol's love for the Vow Park led to a chance meeting with Dunaway. The park held a special place in Carol's heart. She had a reputation for being extroverted, so it's possible that's how she met him. Maybe they just happened to cross paths in the park, and as they laughed and shared stories in the calm environment, they became acquainted. There is no doubt that the park is significant to their relationship because Dunaway lived close to where Carol used to ride her bike. There was a mixture of relief and sorrow following the identification of Thomas Dunaway as Carol Sue Klaber's murderer. The news that Dunaway passed away on December 28, 1990, at the young age of 33, left the family feeling conflicted, even though the authorities consider the case to be closed. Even though the Klaber family is aware of the truth, justice still seems elusive to them. Thomas Klaber bemoaned that he couldn't help but wonder what justice meant anymore and wished he could have confronted Dunaway before his death. Thomas Klaber has been haunted by the memory of his sister's murder. He has carried this burden for almost 50 years, never being able to completely let go of the worry that his family might experience another tragedy. He calls his 28-year-old son, Daniel, late at night because he is so concerned about his safety. Like he lost his beloved sister, he is afraid of losing anyone else who is important to him. It's a fear that holds him in a vice-like grip and serves as a constant reminder of how fleeting life is and how vital it is to cherish the people we care about. The thought of disturbing his sister's final resting place was intolerable to Thomas Klaber. His heart ached at the thought of disturbing her peaceful sleep in order to find her killer. Thankfully, investigators discovered an alternate route. They succeeded in exhuming the body of Carol Sue's killer instead of her remains. The fact that his sister can finally find peace and the small victories are what matter most to Thomas. The recent court order for Detective Cox to exhume Dunaway's body for DNA testing is proof that his commitment to seeking justice knew no bounds. Detective Cox was prepared to face whatever challenges lie ahead. The procedure of entering the DNA into Cody's may be just the start of a new chapter in the pursuit of justice. After almost 50 years, Carol Sue Klaber received her justice. Lewis Kelly, the Commonwealth's attorney for Boone County, has declared the case closed even though her killer cannot be tried in a court of law. Detective Cox's eyes welled up with tears as he shared the bittersweet moment of telling Carol's brother that the murderer had finally been found after all these years. Even though the past cannot be changed, the satisfaction that comes from knowing the truth provides some solace in the wake of such a tragedy. After 46 years, Detective Coy Cox and his team have finally put Carol Sue Klaber's murder mystery to rest, by mentioning Thomas W. Dunaway as the offender. This case demonstrates how committed law enforcement is to seeking justice for victims and their families, regardless of the length of time that may elapse. What do you think about this case? Comment below with your thoughts, and remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more engrossing true crime tales. Stay safe and watch out for the next mystery to come to light.